Just because something is secure doesn't mean that it's safe. The S in HTTPS doesn't always mean safe. On this episode of the Easy Prey podcast, I talk with Casey Crane about trust and encryption. Casey is a cybersecurity writer for Hashed Out at the SSL Store. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Prey podcast. Hey, Casey, thank you for joining me on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Can you give us a little background on who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I work at the SSL Store, which is an SSL TLS certificate provider and digital certificate provider for companies around the world. So essentially what I do is I write content for the website, and I also write content for Hashed Out, which is our industry publication. So kind of my background is in journalism, public relations, and marketing. So I've worked in a variety of different industries, including higher education. And essentially, I got into cybersecurity within just the past few years because I've always had a love for technology and also for crime. As weird as that sounds, I've been passionate about trying to understand it and learning more about it. Obviously, not from a practitioner standpoint. But essentially, I had written my master's thesis on the relationship between serial killers and the media in terms of how they're represented. So how the media represents like the relationship between the killers and law enforcement and different entities within a particular case. So I've just always had kind of a keen interest in learning more about crime and criminal elements. And it just transitioned naturally over time into the realm of technology and cybersecurity as well.
That's really neat. I love hearing people's background and how they got to where they are. And it's very seldom a very straight line. Usually lots of curves at the last minute. With me launching whatismyipaddress.com, that was never 20 years ago. It was never planned as it being a business. I never planned on starting a podcast, but this is just kind of where life has led me. And having dealt with so many people who have been victims of cyber crimes and wanting to provide them with education on how to prevent that from happening in the future or prevent it from happening to their friends and family, it's what really brought me to the podcast and wanting to talk to people like you so that people could be educated and hopefully reduce significantly the opportunity for them to become a criminal, for them to become a victim of a criminal. We don't want anyone to become criminals here.
Exactly. No practitioners here.
No practitioners. So I know it used to be the case that when people are going online and you got an email and you weren't sure if it was from your bank or not, kind of the general practice was if it's an S, that it's secure. S means safe. You click to it. There's this nice green bar at the top of the screen and everything's good and happy. And so that's kind of what people are used to thinking. And we know that over the last year, it's gone from saying secure to not secure to a green bar, no green bar, a red X, no red X, a padlock, no padlock. And who knows where it's going to be a couple of months from now. But I suppose it's probably important for us to talk about is what is HTTPS? What is an SSL certificate in layman's terms so that we don't all have to be computer science graduates?
Sure, absolutely. In the most basic sense, an HTTP is essentially a hypertext transfer protocol. So it's how information transfers between different parties. So for example, if I'm on a website and I type in apple.com and I go to Apple, that connection between my browser, which is known as the client, and the web server where the website's hosted, essentially that connection is not secure. So over time, from the time that HTTP came out, that was back in like 1990, I believe. But over time, it morphed where we developed HTTPS, which is the secure version of it. And I say secure with air quotation marks, in the sense that it's an encrypted communication channel between one party to another. So when you have like an SSL or a TLS certificate, for example, what you're doing is you're enabling that website to have that secure connection, which is great because, that means that any information that you're transferring between your keyboard and your browser to the server essentially is encrypted.
And by that, you mean like important things like credit cards, passwords.
Exactly. Personal information, anything that you don't want in the hands of cybercriminals. So essentially, it's great. But the problem is just because it's secure in the sense of being encrypted doesn't actually mean it's necessarily safe. And the reason that I say that is you can have somebody get a domain validated free certificate, which sounds great, put it on their website, but because it's the lowest level of validation, that means that nobody is actually checking to make sure that the organization itself is who they claim to be. So I could create a website, chuck a DV certificate on there and call it a day. Whether or not it's a real site or not, that's the question.
So
So when
someone
people,
could create like bankofamerica.com with an L instead of an I, or an I instead of a common
exactly,
misspelling. And if I'm not an observant user, that person can just say, the person who's running the site can just go out and get a certificate, which basically says, yes, the person who requested the certificate is the person who is running the site.
right.
But not that it's any legal entity or anything of that nature.
Exactly. So domain validated essentially means that the person who requests a certificate gets an email, and that email might have a link or it might have some files that they would have to upload to that web server. And that's really about it. So there are two levels of validation above it, which are organization validation and extended validation. And I know there's a lot of back and forth in the industry about the value of extended validation versus organization validation. But basically, what it does is it helps to validate that the organization is who it says it is, because they have to go through a series of checks and balances. And the issuing CA, or what's known as a certificate authority, actually has to essentially do a background check on the organization requesting the certificate for both the OV certificates and the EV. It's just that the EV ones require additional background information.
Gotcha. So it's more complex than just sending out an email and getting a response back. There's some additional documentation,
Exactly.
proving that the person who's requesting the certificate actually works for the entity, is a legal representative of them, that sort of stuff.
Exactly. So it takes several days to get an OV or an EV certificate. With a DV, which is that, again, that minimal level, you can get a certificate within a few minutes. So that's kind of an issue that we've run into within the industry as an SSL or a TLS certificate provider, is we've seen the rise in phishing sites. So the Anti-Phishing Working Group, which is the APWG, they reported in their Q4 report, and I'm sorry, I go into that. It's the journalist in me. I'm used to putting the acronym in there. Essentially, in their Q4 report, they said that nearly 3/4 of websites that were phishing websites used an SSL or a TLS certificate.
Wow, that's really important to know. So just that old rule of thumb that if it has an S, it's safe, it's secure, really doesn't apply anymore.
Right. So there are other things that you need to be able to do as a web user to stay safe. And part of that is actually just knowing how to read the browser. So, for example, if you're searching Google and you're looking at stuff and you want to pull up a website and it looks like it says apple.com, it may not actually be apple.com. You have issues. There's something called Unicode. So there are Unicode domains which basically pull from different languages, all these different characters and numerals and signs, and those are now being used in web domains. So it used to be only ASCII characters, which were based on, the English language. So US English characters and numbers and symbols and all that. So you could use Cyrillic language, for example, as part of Unicode and come up with a domain that looks just like apple.com.
So they have some character in their language, looks very similar to an L, or almost maybe even exactly the same as an L, but because it's not technically an L,
right.
It's a different domain name and a different website.
Right. Thankfully, those are more few and far between than traditional phishing sites, which would just be switching out, the L in Apple for an I, or switching it out for something else like a number one. So there are ways that people go around it, but realistically, criminals tend to go for the lowest hanging fruit. They want to make this as easy as possible for themselves to save time, make the most profit, or achieve whatever agenda they might have most quickly. So usually it's just swapping out a character here and there. So if, for example, if you are checking your email and you get an email from what looks to be your boss, what you'd want to do is before you ever click on anything, check the actual header information within the email. See who the email is coming from. It may list their name, but the email may not match. And the email may be off by just one letter or one digit if there's a number in the URL or in the domain.
And we know that happens. That actually happened with one of the hosts of Shark Tank.
Correct.
Is
Yeah.
that her bookkeeper got an email that looked like it came from Barbara's assistant, but it was just one letter was different in the domain name or the email address, and so the bookkeeper went ahead and wired several $100,000 to the scammer.
Unfortunately, yeah. And she's not the only one. I mean, this has happened to big companies and organizations. There are different forms of phishing. I won't get into all the different types, but I mean, Google and Facebook, for example, they were taken for more than $100 million between the
Oh
two of
my
them.
goodness.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, somebody was impersonating a vendor that they worked with, and essentially there were invoices sent back and forth that they paid and via these wire transfers. And yeah, it was somebody in another country that had nothing to do with the vendor that they were pretending to be. Um, so these are definitely areas of concern for anybody, both as a consumer and as a business owner or manager within an organization, that kind of thing. Another recent example, timely, is the coronavirus.
Mm-hmm.
So Johns Hopkins University, they had a website that a phisher decided to scam. They created this fake website. I'm not going to give you the URL because naturally somebody's probably going to type it in. But essentially what ended up happening is they created this fake site for people to go to, trying to find out where's the spread of the virus, what countries has it hit, how many people are affected. And what ended up happening is a piece of malware, a Trojan, was actually downloaded from this website onto the computers of unsuspecting users.
That's scary.
Yeah, it really is. So I know, like the health sector cybersecurity coordination center, they had put out a report saying, "Hey, beware of any sort of phishing site that's trying to essentially pretend to be like a coronavirus tracker."
Yeah, and I know I probably get a half a dozen emails that are getting through the spam filter every day now saying, click here for coronavirus news. Click here to log into your health provider to schedule your coronavirus test, or
exactly.
Click here from, your city has this important information about locking down your city. Click here. So it's like, oh my gosh, all these things that people want to be aware of are really, all these very emotional, stressful, urgent sort of situations going on that the scammers are really just trying to take advantage of.
Well, you hit the head on the nail there, in that essentially it's all about urgency. It's creating some sort of feeling of urgency or curiosity or concern where people are motivated to want to answer that email quickly or to click on the link or to call a specific number that's provided. It's essentially just creating that feeling of fear or urgency to get someone to do something.
Mm-hmm.
That's the tactic that a lot of cyber criminals will use, in addition, to social engineering and other tactics as well.
Yeah. And I know definitely with the over time, the cost of SSL certificates have come down significantly. I remember when I was a long time ago, I remember buying SSL certificates, and I think they were $300-400 a year for the least amount of validation there was. I don't think anyone did domain validation at the time, but it's come down to very small numbers, which makes it easier for the scammers to get the certificates. You've got platforms like Let's Encrypt, which create free SSL certificates, which is good for the technical cases where that, where that works. But unfortunately, once something becomes free, you've eliminated a barrier to entry. You've limited a scale barrier. And, well, great, now I can get 1,000 certificates on 1,000 domain names that are all set up to scam people, and I don't have to lay out a dime, which is kind of one of those scary things about when prices go down.
Exactly. So from a website like owner perspective or an admin perspective, it's just knowing which certificate you should also be putting on your site. When is a DV certificate applicable versus an OV or an EV certificate? So if you're running like a blog where you're not collecting information, handling information, doing transactions, anything like that, you can get away with a DV certificate.
Yeah.
If you're collecting personal information, credit card information, doing anything financial, any sort of PII or financial info that you don't want out there, that's when you should be using a OV certificate as a minimum.
Mm-hmm. And I know that it used to be kind of this mindset of like, well, it's just my personal blog. Why do I even need an SSL certificate? If I'm not collecting usernames and passwords and credit cards, why even have an SSL certificate? Is there a reason for people to have an SSL certificate, even if they're not collecting personal information?
Absolutely. It's changed over the past few years. You never used to have one or were required to have one. But now Google essentially will penalize websites that don't have a certificate because they're viewed as being insecure. So that's why, if you type in a URL and that little padlock doesn't come up, it might say not secure on there. Essentially, Google's going, you don't want to be here. It's going to post up one of those really ugly warning signs. It's going to drive users away from your site. So you have every reason to want to put that on there. Another benefit that's been tossed around in recent years is the advantage of what they refer to as SEO, or search engine optimization. So as part of Google's algorithm to essentially weigh the value of your site and deem whether it's a reputable, authoritative site, is checking to see whether there is, in fact, a certificate that's assigned to that site and is valid.
And I know there was, I've read several instances in news stories over the year of kind of some small, very boutique internet service providers that when people using their service would visit a site that wasn't secure, the internet service provider would actually change the content of the website. They would remove the website's ads and insert their own ads where they would be making money off of people visiting the site. So I know for people in countries where maybe the internet service providers are less reputable, or your government, you are concerned about your government snooping on what you're doing, having that encrypted communication channel between you and the website prevents not the fact that you are visiting the website from being seen, but at least the content of what's going back and forth between the website, that's secure, and people aren't adding payloads into that unless the server's been hacked. But we won't talk about that.
Yeah, that's a whole nother ball of wax. But yeah, it does help to prevent those man-in-the-middle attacks and eavesdropping attacks.
Yeah, and that's, it's, to me, those are always those are the, like you talked about, the low-hanging fruit of like, well, okay, there are plugins for browsers that will check to see if the website actually supports SSL and give you the SSL version of the secure version of the site, as opposed to the insecure if the site operates and supports both. So
right.
There are some tools out there that actually help to make sure that if we're using these tools, they actually help to make sure that we're at least a little bit safer wherever we can be, because sometimes things aren't configured quite correctly, and those little things help out.
And sometimes an issue that people will run into is they just forget to check their certificates. They aren't properly managing them, or they're trying to use like manual methods like an Excel spreadsheet to manage a few hundred certificates. It's not ideal. It's not optimal. And what it's going to happen is that site's going to become invalid and expire, and that site is going to be marked as, not secure, and it's going to drive everybody away. You're just going to run into a lot of different issues, both in the admin sense and from the user sense.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen those scenarios where the SSL certificate has expired, and you go to the site and you get this big red notice from Google or whichever browser you're using that basically says, hey, this site isn't secure. Are you really, really sure that you want to do it? And you hit a button that says, really? It's not a good idea. Are you really sure? And, depending on your settings, you can occasionally get through it. Sometimes if you're in an office building where your IT department is more concerned about security, they'll actually prevent you from getting to sites like that where the certs have expired.
Absolutely. And that's, kudos and hats off to the IT admins who make that happen. Unfortunately, not all companies do that, though. So if you have employees who, on their lunch break decide to surf the web and check things out, that can obviously lead to a lot of potential security issues for organizations.
Yeah, and I know even from having been on the administrative of those things, like you said, it can be very difficult to remember, when did we renew this certificate? When is it supposed to be renewed? And, well, we actually physically migrated it to a different box, so out of sequence, we had a new certificate issued, and it really can be difficult to manage all those things if you have more than one website.
Exactly. And it's also, I'm sure you've probably seen or heard about this issue from other guests on your show, is the concern about shadow IT certificates. Somebody else might have installed it, or somebody installed it and then they forgot it or didn't write it down. And there's this certificate that nobody's tracking.
Yep. And then I occasionally see the concerns of that. I know that I think the Safari browser is now starting to be concerned about certificates that are valid for really long periods of time. So the thought was for a while was, well, gosh, we know renewal is difficult, so let's make this certificate valid for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And now Safari, and I assume Google will probably, Chrome will probably fall in line as well, that like, well, if someone hasn't touched this in 5, 6, 7 years, are we really sure that this is what it's supposed to be? Maybe we should shorten up these dates. What's the kind of the reasoning behind that?
Essentially, the idea is the shorter that the validation is for a certificate, the more secure it is, because there would be less time for a cyber criminal to be able to crack the encryption that's involved. Because essentially, SSL certificates, or TLS, really, we just use the terms interchangeably within the industry. It's technically a TLS certificate, though. But essentially, those certificates use public key encryption. So there's a public key, there's a private key. They're used to essentially work together, though they're mathematically different keys. But what they do is they help to create an encrypted environment where you can transfer that data back and forth. But essentially, what the issue is somebody could, if they had the right computer technology, or they were somehow able to find the exact combination of bytes to break this, they could eventually crack the encryption. That's the concern. Realistically, it would take, with the current encryption standards, it would take millions and millions and millions of years, realistically, to do that. The concerns would be with, the upcoming quantum, computing and post-quantum cryptography not yet being available. Those are kind of the concerns for a lot of people. So Apple is going, hey, we want to shorten this lifespan to a little bit more than a year, essentially. I don't remember the exact number of days, but it's essentially a year and like the renewal period. Yeah. That's what it boils down to. So the current standard is for validation, it's 2 years for public certificates, like the leaf certificates, that kind of thing. It was 3 years. It previously was 5 years. It's continually changing. So I'm anticipating that it's going to keep changing. We've seen the writing on the wall. We knew this was coming, but it's a matter of how quickly and to what extent that validity period will be shortened.
Yeah, and I suppose as that time period shortens down, the need for management tools come into play, because I can't be having a feeler on my calendar. Well, every first day of the month, I've got to go out and do this process to renew a certificate. That just becomes incredibly onerous. And imagine if I've got 100 sites, I'm doing 3 of those a day, every day of the month, every day of the year. That could just be crazy. So, are there tools out there that help people to manage larger volumes of certificates in this kind of renewal process?
There are certificate managers. So these are basically programs that you can use to help you manage certificates and manage the life cycle of the certificate. So you can renew certificates, you could, discover what certificates you have on, within your environment. So those sort of tools can help you do that. There are a variety of different tools out there. With our company, we do sell one, but it's just a matter of what your preferences are, of course, and what your needs are. There are different levels, of course. So I would definitely recommend not using manual methods like an Excel spreadsheet to try to manage these. I believe it was Key Factor. They had just done a study or released a report that was talking about the number of certificates that a lot of enterprises believe that they have. And I say believe because they're not even certain how many certificates they have. And I could be wrong. I want to say it was like 30-something% said that they had 10,000 or more certificates.
Oh my goodness.
So you're talking a significant number. So even if you wanted to put, a notification on your calendar once a month, they're all going to have different expiry dates.
That's like a full-time job, just renewing certificates.
Absolutely.
If not longer than, if not multiple people.
Exactly. So that's when a certificate manager would really come in handy.
And that reduces the amount of time and effort that it takes to regenerate keys and do all I forget the technical lingo, but to make sure that you're actually doing both ends of the process.
Absolutely. Another benefit too is that, when you're able to keep your certificates valid and you're not having to deal with expired certificates, you're helping to ideally avoid downtime
Yeah.
with your site. You're helping to avoid any issues that could come from that, including potentially financial penalties.
Yeah,
So,
I've definitely run across that where there was a site of mine that I was running. I'm not sure why at the time I got an SSL certificate for it. It wasn't collecting any information, but maybe it's just out of that kind of that best practice mindset of, hey, that's a good thing to do. Certificates are relatively inexpensive compared to what the site was doing. And it wasn't a site that I was updating or really doing anything content wise. And at some point, someone emailed me and said, hey, the certificate for your site expired like a month ago. I'm like, so I go back and look at my analytics, and, lo and behold, traffic had dried up. It wasn't getting any more traffic from search anymore. I'm like, because I just, it was one of those things that I probably got an email saying, hey, don't forget your certificate is renewing or needs to be renewed. And I went, okay, I'm sure I'll remember that. And I didn't do it. And lo and behold, the site,
Exactly. And that's unfortunately an issue that a lot of people run into. So our customer experience team, they're always trying to help people. And, with our company, for example, we sell the certificates. So we send out notifications ahead of time saying, hey, your certificate is expiring. Hey, you still haven't done it. You got to renew your certificate. And we'll just, keep reminding them. But ultimately, it's down to the individual to do it. And that's where that certificate manager just really shines.
Yeah. I know that I've gotten as different entities have called me as certificates are getting close to expiration. Sometimes it's the issuer saying, hey, we're calling just to let you know it's expiring tomorrow. Are you sure? And other time it's unfortunately competitors of theirs calling saying, hey, we noticed that you haven't renewed. If you switch with us, and then they go on to lie about, well, your security will be better if you use our certificate. Or, they make up some mumbo jumbo, or, our certificates are more trusted by Google.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's actually something people don't oftentimes realize is the actual encryption from certificate to certificate is the same. It's still the standard encryption that's provided. It's just the additional benefits that you get or the additional features that you get that vary from each certificate.
Yeah, I remember that. It was just so funny because my thought process, as soon as the guy said, well, our certificates have better encryption, I'm like, okay, I'm never going to use your company. I'm never going to ever recommend anyone use your company because you're just flat out lying to me.
Right.
And if the salesperson is lying to me, what other places are they cutting corners on the back end? Are they not maintaining their database securely? Are they not keeping everything else secure? Like, what other things are they not doing? Which was incredibly concerning to me at the time.
Absolutely. Well, the good thing is, at least, you're a knowledgeable user. You are able to identify essentially the BS.
Yeah.
Not a lot of people can.
Yeah, and most people that are doing mom and pop sites are not. Luckily, I have a background in IT and been working in IT for many years. Anytime anyone has tried to talk technical or someone from an IT perspective has called one of my bosses who's not in IT, they just assume that everything that's being told to them is legitimate and correct, and it can be concerning at times.
Absolutely.
So if people want to, they've been convinced that, oh my gosh, my blog is not secure. I want to secure my blog. Where can they go to get an SSL certificate? What should they be looking at in making that decision of what's right for them?
Sure. So they can choose from a variety of different options. They can go to a certificate authority itself. There is Sectigo, which was formerly Komodo CA. You have DigiCert, which was a transition from Symantec. You've got Entrust. You've got GoDaddy. There are a lot of different companies out there. So with my company, the SSL Store, we work with several of the major certificate authorities. So we work with Sectigo, we work with DigiCert, we work with a lot of different organizations, and we also sell their sub-brands. So you've got like Positive SSL, you've got Instant SSL, Essential SSL, things like that. So you've got essentially kind of like the different, what they would consider different tiers of certificates. So what you would want to do is you want to find a reputable source, whether it's the CA or a reseller, somebody that you would feel comfortable working with, somebody you can trust. And then what you want to do is figure out, okay, what level of validation do I need for a certificate? Do I need the domain validated because I'm not handling anything sensitive or anything of concern? If something were to fall through the cracks in the sense of like a man in the middle attack, it's nothing that you would have to worry about being out there. So that could be just a DV certificate. You might want to go with the OV because, you're working with some personally sensitive information or financial information. Same with the extended validation, which is the even higher level of validation. So once you decide what level of validation you need, you also need to choose essentially the functionality of the certificate. So you can have a certificate for single domains, for multiple domains, and their wildcards. And then you could also have it for just wildcards, which would be the subdomains on a single level. So depending on what it is that you're looking for, you would pick that validation level, you pick the functionality of the certificate. You want to also choose a particular brand, and you want to choose the warranty because these certificates actually do come with a warranty as well. And it's just all these different factors together help you to determine which certificate you might want to buy.
That's great. That's really helpful information. I think that gives people enough to at least start their journey and get their foot in the door and figure out what direction they need to go and figure out what's right for them.
Exactly.
So if people want to find out more about you, or how do they get to the SSL store?
Sure. So we're actually on social media, and we have our website. For our website, it's the SSLstore.com. For our blog, which is hashed out, it's the SSLstore.com/blog, the blog. So they can follow us there. They can subscribe to our blog. And furthermore, we actually have some industry resources that might be useful to people. So they can download our complimentary email security best practices guide. And there's also a certificate management checklist that we have on there as well. So if people are wanting to kind of know, where do I really stand with regard to certificate management? Am I checking all the boxes? We literally have the checklist for you.
That's great. We'll make sure that I think that would be really helpful. We'll make sure that we link to the certificate management checklist in the show notes. That way people can find it easily. And I'll get that from you and get it up on the site when this episode goes live.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Casey, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate the time, and I really appreciate that there's people out there that are taking security seriously and really trying to help people keep their personal information personal and their public information public.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Pray podcast. If you found this episode helpful, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Casey Crane can be found at easypray.com/12. Have you been the victim of a scam, and are you interested in sharing your story with the Easy Pray audience? Head over to easypray.com/mystory to learn more.